Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss again here at allpointstv.com and also WFOV. I don't know why I forget that studio. This our co-partners here, and we're very glad to have them aboard. 92.1 on your radio dial, and we'll be airing this program on that network on Saturday at 12 o'clock in the afternoon. Very glad to be a part of that operation there.
I think it's brought a lot of attention to you too, that radio station, and you being aired there too. I think it brought a lot.
I think so, and I want to I always want to give a commendation to the great visionary here in the city of Flint. I think Paul Herring is one of those unsung heroes in the city, doing a great job over there on University Drive, and I like to always give him credit for what he's done here in terms of creating a studio out of whole cloth, and they're off and running, and they're doing some excellent programming over there. Sometimes you turn on the radio at 92.1 and you can't stop listening. And I don't have a lot of time, but when I start to listen to the programs, they have one program that comes on at 9 o'clock, the Tom Summer Show, and it comes on 5 days a week from 9 to 12. And he does an excellent job, and have the program on Wednesday when they have the have a guest coming in from 10 to 12 is always very good to tune it in. There's always some very good information on that program. We have some good information here at this program as well. We are the program called What's Going On. We come on at 2 o'clock in the afternoon live, and you can pick us up at any time at your leisure on YouTube, allpointstv.com. I want to thank the studio technicians. You know, we come before the camera and everybody sees what we do. We don't see the technicians behind the scenes. They do a lot of things here. The lighting has to be taken care of. You have to have somebody that's doing the cameras, and then the person that does the audio and making sure everything is done correctly along that line. And without them, we couldn't do what we do. We take all of the public accolades, but the people behind the scenes are the ones that make this program work, and other programs here at allpointstv.com. I want to commend everybody that's associated with this production. John, let me ask you a question here. Do you know what today is, the special day in the country's history is today?
I have to see. I can't scramble to go to Google, so I have to admit my ignorance at this point. Okay, I'll have to admit my ignorance.
This is Constitution Day. This is the day in which the
okay, I'm gonna say the what?
The Constitution. The Constitution Day. This is the day in which the Constitution was, in fact, the Constitution Convention had come together, and they had proposed the Constitution on the 17th of September, 1787, and now it is going to the states for ratification, and it'll be ratified July the 2nd, 1788. But the proposal of the Constitution was in fact completed at the Constitution Convention in 1787 on this date. Let me ask you, John, what city was the Constitution Convention held in then? I know you're going to get this one right.
Okay, I thought I would, but you can always stump me. So was it Philadelphia?
Philadelphia.
Yeah, okay.
John's pretty good. And they went there. They'd gone there in 1786 in Annapolis, Maryland, and they didn't have enough. They didn't have a quorum based upon the 13 colonies, and therefore they had to adjourn the meeting that they had called in Maryland. But they had the Shea Rebellion in that year, and now the need to have that convention is even more excellent than it was at that time, and so they're calling another convention. This time, what they'll do is they went there to revise the Articles of Confederation to make the central government stronger. But having gotten there and looking at all of the things that were wrong with the Articles of Confederation, they decided instead that the document was beyond repair, and they made up their minds what they had to do here was, in fact, to bring about a new document that would in fact give the federal government more power. At the same time, they wanted to do what the articles had tended to do, and that was to not allow the federal government to become so powerful it would get out of control. So what they did is a stroke of genius on their part. What they did was to give the federal government more power, but to disperse the powers of the federal government in three branches, giving co-equal authority to all three, where you would have one corridor making the law, another corridor of the federal government would in fact enforce the law, and then another corridor would in fact interpret the law and keep it under control, keep the government under control by restraining it based upon what the Constitution allowed for and the mandates therein. So it was a brilliant thing that happened in Philadelphia, and on the 17th of September, 1787, they had finished the document, having gone there almost 3 months earlier. They had gone to Philadelphia July the 24th, and they were about 7 days short of it, of them being in session for 3 months. But by the 17th of September, they had drawn the document up and worked out this magnificent document, which I don't think has been actually anywhere in the world. We haven't a document that comes anywhere close to it in terms of the division of powers and separating it into different corridors so that each one can check on the other, the check and balance system, and the separation of powers, and the things that would keep the things that were intended to keep the government in check. I don't think we've reached that brilliance anywhere in the world since that time, and the document that was drawn up in 1787 became the envy of the world, some of which you saw take place in France, when France had its revolution 13 years after the revolution had been conjured up in the United States in 1776 in this country. In 1789, you see the revolution starting off in France, and that was again inspired by what had happened here. Anyway, it's a day in which we should in fact acknowledge the framers. I'm going to see today too. I'm going to see if that is going to be stated on these networks, because we don't tend to get back to what the framers tried to do at the Constitutional Convention in terms of restraining government power. And because the government is so out of control right now, and the politicians are totally, seemingly intending to go outside of the Constitution and not be restrained by what the mandates are therein, I want to see what's going to happen today. Are they going to acknowledge the day as the Constitutional Day, and are they going to go back and visit some of the ideas that were the foundation ideas of this country, where we have the government supposedly under the restraints, government of the people, by the people, for the people. And in the preamble of the Constitution, it says, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, more perfect than it was under the Articles of Confederation. We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. In that document, we the people of the United States, meaning that the Constitution is drawn up by the people, for the people, as a way of dictating to government what government should do, because it's restrained by the people, only taking those liberties and those powers that are bestowed upon it by the people, who are the custodians of the country. That's the idea. And of course, by over the 200 and some odd years we've been in existence, government did here what is done everywhere else has been instituted. Governments are instituted among men, according to the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, see, rights that you already have that are unalienable, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men to secure the rights that you're born with, deriving their just powers, consistent with what's in the Constitution, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So we are the ones that are supposed to be in charge, and government derives its just powers. I didn't say derive its powers, derive its just powers from the consent of the governed. If they have any powers beyond that, which is in fact bestowed upon them by the people, then those powers are unjust because it's not bestowed upon the government by the citizenry. So we have to keep that in mind as we're going forward, and we're seeing all these things that are taking place today, where we have these people suborning what was intended by the framers. But I'll be watching. I'm going to see how many of these networks in the course of the day will acknowledge this special day, and how many of them are going to go back and talk about those great persons that met in that room, who, according to Ayn Rand in a book called The New Intellectuals, Ayn Rand, the great philosopher, who was born in 1905 and died in 1982, Ayn Rand, in her book, one of her best books, The New Intellectuals, said that the framers were this country's first intellectuals, and so far his last intellectuals. And that's saying a lot, because a lot of these persons think these people in these classrooms are, intellectuals, but those were intellectuals in that room, and we've never had as much intellectual power in that room assembled in one place. We've never had that repeated anywhere in this country, and it's certainly not repeated at these universities, and that includes Harvard and all these Ivy League schools, Yale and Cornell, Brown, you name these other schools. And you don't have that kind of intellectual wherewithal meeting in one place at one time. You don't have that kind of you don't have these philosophers. These philosophers, all of them meeting in Philadelphia. These are some very smart people, and they had studied a lot of things that had happened in history, and they realized mistakes had been made by other governments, and they tried to, at the very beginning of the country, to preclude that from happening here, because they saw where some of the errors had been made, going back to all of these empires that are written about by this French writer, Count Constantin C.F. Volney, in his book called The Ruins of Empire, and had read Volney's work and some of the other works, and they had found out what brought these countries to their end. And Volney's book is very important along that line. And what they had done is they had read all these other writers who were writing about government. They had studied John Locke. They had studied Thomas Paine, and in his book, in his pamphlet, The Common Sense. And they were bringing all this information into that room, and they were looking at what had happened with other governments, and they decided that they had, at the articles, when they drew that up, they were correct in trying to limit power of the federal government. Didn't want it concentrated in one place because they had been victimized by themselves, and also they had seen it. That also was what happened in Rome, and some of the problems that happened in Greece, and in Egypt, Persia, Syria, and all these empires that there were in the ancient world, and they were deciding that they had to do something different. And it was a tremendous document the world had never seen before. We'd never seen a document at the inception of the country where they are trying to write to restrain power, to make sure it doesn't go out of control, because they realized what had happened in the past was that the politicians will accrue power, and then they will in fact begin to accrue more and more power unto themselves, and before you know it, they have a government that is in fact tyrannical, and they wanted to preclude that from happening here. So it's a great document. We'll see what's going to happen today. I'm going to see if anybody is going to be mentioning the foundational moments of the country. On another note, I was on radio program this past weekend, and when I go on these programs, because there's so much confusion about this country's history, and you have these people talking about, they'll say he's a Republican, and of course they'll say because they are Democrats, and you know, to my ears, they don't realize how ridiculous that is. Because you have to know the history of the country to see how that sounds. It sounds ridiculous. And what I'm saying here is that if you go back to the foundational moments of this country, you'll see that the answer to Alexander Hamilton. You know, Hamilton was the Secretary of Treasury appointed by the great George Washington, the first and only great president we've had. We've only had one great president, by the way, in this country's history, and that was George Washington, who had to get it right, because if he gets it wrong, then we don't have this experiment being able to take off. And what George Washington did was to disavow any lust for power, and he did it on 2 different occasions, and the world was stunned, by the way, by what George Washington had done, because they'd never seen a person to ride in on a white horse after conquering the governing group. And then in conquest, would in fact not ride in as a conquering authority, but would ride in to submit his resignation and go back to his home and give up power, as he did when the war came to a close in 1783. They had never seen that before. And then after being elected in 1789, really he was elected in 1788, the same year the Constitution was ratified, he was elected in 1788 and took office in March 4th, 1789. When he served the first term, he was unanimously elected. The electoral college, there were no votes against the president, and when he ran again in 1792, he was again unopposed. And there were some that wanted to make George Washington king, and George Washington, going back and looking at what occurred with the other George III, had refused to be appointed for a life term. He probably could have been a life term president, because that's where his popularity was at that time. But George Washington disavowed power again, and in 1797, first of all, 1796, because he didn't run again, but in 1797, when his term was up, on March the 4th, 1797, George Washington went back to Mount Vernon, and the world was stunned once again. George Washington had done something that nobody in the world had ever done, and this makes him our greatest president and the only great president we've had. All these other persons are pretending to the throne of being great presidents. We've had one great president, and that's the one that got the experiment off the ground and allowed it to be incubated during his presidency, so that we'd have the president set in terms of disavowal of power. And his 2-term president, by the way, wasn't broken until 1940 under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. You know, Roosevelt came in there, and then being a wartime president, with the war breaking out and World War II breaking out in 1939, using that as a cover for his tyranny and for his lust for power. Being involved, being that the Second World War had broken out, he used that as a way of ferreting out for himself and carving out more power for his administration. He did not leave office after 2 terms and broke the 2-term precedent that had been in place from 1796, when Washington decided not to run for a 3rd term. Had been in place from that point all the way up to 1940, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt broke that precedent, and now we have to have an amendment. The amendment that was the 22nd Amendment that would in fact do what George Washington had done through setting the tradition, but now we need to have a law that would fix the terms for 2 terms. So the president is now put into law in 1951 when he ratified the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution. But what I was saying here, being on that program this past Saturday, that I always have to speak to this because they want to say that you are a Republican and they are Democrats. I want to clear something up here that goes to the heart of the history of this country. Anybody that is a Democrat has to also be a Republican. You cannot be a Republican without being a Democrat. But it has nothing to do, and this is the other point I want to make, but it has nothing to do with either one of these putrid, poverty-stricken, corrupt political parties. People say, he's a Republican. And that's true. I'm also a Democrat. And that goes back to the very foundation of the country. Because when Alexander Hamilton, who set up really he was the architect in the Washington administration, but being the Secretary of the Treasury, he was at odds with the other person who was the architect of that administration. That was Thomas Jefferson, who was the Secretary of State. And the Federalist Party, which was developed around, and you get different dates. I would say that it's developed around in the year 1792. The Federalist Party, which was the party that wanted to centralize power in the federal government. And that was a problem because of the way the founders, who were still alive and were at that convention, not that Jefferson was at the convention, but those who were at the convention were aware. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, was there, of course, and they knew that the power the federal government had been induced by the states deciding to give some of its sovereignty up in order to create the federal government. And they knew that the states were to be in charge because that's where the localization of power was, where the people are, in the states. And the states had behooved to the federal government some of its own power, some of their own power, and they gave that voluntarily to the federal government in order to create a stronger federal government, which could not have been created unless the sovereignty claims of the states had been somewhat relinquished, so that they are able to create a strong federal government because they needed more security based upon the Shays' Rebellion that occurred in 1786. So they were doing this as a way of bringing about greater protection, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, more perfect than it was under the Articles of Confederation. Establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, because Shays' Rebellion had broken up the domestic tranquility, and they wanted to ensure domestic tranquility, so you have to have a stronger federal government. But how are you going to do that? At the same time, you're going to limit the authority of the federal government. And they found a way to do that in terms of the disaggregation of power, and which was unheard of because power was always centralized, and you had always had kings. Well, George Washington was a very big part of that. But the point I'm trying to make here is that in setting up the first government, because under the Constitution, it is an experiment, and the experiment can go wrong, can go very badly if, in fact, those persons at the foundation moments of the country would, in fact, not adhere to the restraints. And Alexander Hamilton, who was an admirer of the monarchy in Britain, wanted to somewhat replicate some of the power that he, in fact, had been one of the progenitors in terms of, he was a general in the Continental Army, being one of the persons fighting against the powers that were arrayed against them in the colonists, but at the same time, wanting to some extent, replicate that power centralized in the federal government when they became the power source. And so now there's a lot of friction between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. You can read about this, by the way, in this great book written by one of the great biographers of our time, and that's a guy by the name of Ron Chernoff, who has a book out called Hamilton. And I think that play, by the way, on Hamilton was somewhat taken from this book. But Ron Chernoff has written, everything he writes, every biography he's written, it's like 800 pages. You're going to be there for a while. But I think that Hamilton was trying to replicate the kind of power that he was against when the British were the powers over the 13 colonists. We're going to take a break right now from WFOV, and I hope you'll come back in 4 minutes. We'll see you on the other side of the break. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, we're going to continue what we're doing here at allpointstv.com, and we will continue what we're discussing. And if we're too far away from where we were when WFOV took a break, we will in fact catch them up on this side of it, the other side of it. Hamilton was trying to replicate in some ways the kind of imperial power of the government that they had fought against in the Revolutionary War, and he was in fact opposed by Thomas Jefferson and also by the father of the Constitution, James Madison. And so in 1792, they decide that they are going to set up an antidote to the Federalist Party, and they set up the Democratic Republican Party. In the same year, 1792, they set up the Democratic Republican Party. So the Democrat-Republican Party was considered to be the same party. It's the Democrats, Republicans were the same people, because you really can't be a Republican if you understand what Republicanism is. You can't be a Republican and not be a Democrat. But in other words, the people's voice. But the people's voice is not only in terms of the voice of the people, but you have to also restrain the people's voice as well. And so then the people's voice is restrained by what? The people's voice is restrained on republicanism. They say the majoritarian rule on the law, so that the tyranny of the majority would not go out of control. And anyone that doesn't, if you don't understand that, you need to go read Hamilton before Hamilton becomes the Secretary of the Treasury, because Hamilton wrote in Federalist Paper number 9. Go read Federalist Paper number 9, and then go read Federalist Paper number 10. 9 written by Alexander Hamilton, and then go read Federalist Paper number 10 written by James Madison. James Madison wrote, don't tell me, James Madison wrote 29 of the Federalist Papers. Hamilton, who was probably the smartest person in the country at that time, wrote 51 of the Federalist Papers. And go read go read Hamilton's Federalist Paper number 9 by Alexander Hamilton. This is kind of hypocrite that he was, because they were trying to fix this problem of what do you do with factions, particularly the most dangerous faction you have, which is the majoritarian faction, because the majority can in fact oppress the minority. And so how do you in fact restrain the majority faction without oppressing the majority's faction's right to exist? I mean, factions have a right to exist, and so therefore, being the fact that if you are a democratically endowed government and society with majorities forming, how do you restrict the majority faction so that it does not become tyrannical? Because tyranny can exist in many forms, and many times a majority can become tyrannical because they can in fact vote themselves to dominate the minority faction and then take advantage of the minority faction because they have the numbers. Okay, we are very glad that we have WFOV joining us again, and we're glad to have you back at 92.1. We're not very far from where we were when you took a break, and we're very glad to have you back. What I'm saying is that the Democratic Republicans were one party. From 1792 to 18, I'm going to say, and you get different dates here, from 1792 to 1825. And therefore, they will put it right there with the first attempt on the part of Andrew Jackson to become the President of the United States. He wasn't successful in that year, but he would become successful in 1828 and will be elected President of the United States. And he will set up what became the Democratic Party, and then the Republican Party, which had been the party of Jefferson, the Democratic Republican Party, the party of Jefferson, the party of James Madison, who was the fourth president, and also the party of James Monroe. And at the end of the era of good feeling, which was Monroe's administration from 1817 to 1825, you see then that after that period was over, then the Democratic Republican Party splits, and Andrew Jackson, who became president in 1829, having been elected in 1828, Jackson will then become the first person to be elected as a Democratic party holder. But don't forget now that both the Democrat Party and the Republican Party was really one party. The Democratic Republican Party was one party. So when people say that you are that you are a Republican, the question, the statement is ridiculous, because they are associating that with the two parties that are now naming themselves Democrat and Republican, as if they're naming something different. A Democrat has to be a Republican, and a Republican has to be a Democrat. When you say, are you a Republican, the answer is yes. Are you a Democrat, the answer is also yes. But it has nothing to do with these two parties in terms of what claims you're making. And I make the claim that there are no Democrats in the Democratic Party. Just because you call yourself a Democrat doesn't make you a Democrat. And just because you call yourself a Republican doesn't make you a Republican, because those words mean something. And when they say they guarantee in the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 4, that every state is guaranteed a Republican form of government, I don't see a Republican form of government anywhere in the country. Not in Michigan, where we are with this program here, not next door in Ohio, not over there on the other side in Indiana, and then Illinois. Where do you have a Republican form of government? It's guaranteed in the Constitution, but you don't have it anywhere in the country. The Republican form of government means that the people's voice comes through under rule of law. That's the way you restrain majoritarian factions. That say the majority is restrained by republicanism. So you have the majority rule, but the majority just can't do anything it wants to do. It has to be by the rule of law, not by just going out of control because you have the numbers, but restrained by republicanism, which is restrained by the people's voice, as it is in fact behooving to them, those in power, based upon what has been dictated to them by the Constitution and the laws that are set up in order to maintain the rule of law under Constitution mandates. It's a Republican form of government on a majoritarian rule, but both of them working together, Democrat and Republicanism working together as a way of another restraint of power. It's not just separation of powers. Separation of powers is one way of doing it, and the check and balance is another way of doing it. And then, of course, putting some powers on the federal level and some powers on the state level is another way of doing it. But the other way was to have Democratic and Republicanism operating together to secure the liberties that are, in fact, stated in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That's to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So the rule of law, republicanism, the rule of law, and then the democratic aspect, where you have the majority voice, where the will of the people in the majority under the law is carried out by the elected officials. Now, raise your hand. Raise your hand if you see that happening anywhere in the country at the present time, because we don't have that right now, but we're trying to get back to it. And I was waiting. I was not surprised, and I was just waiting for this new attack upon the process where we have the Senate supposedly in place to do the people's will. The president nominates members to the Supreme Court. The court checks upon the credentials of the nominee with the consent of the, and also the, to put their input into the process. But they look at the credentials of the nominee, and they are supposed, therefore, to confirm the president's right to nominate members of the Supreme Court. I was just waiting. I knew it was going to happen at some point, that if they could not, those persons call themselves Democrats now, I knew that if they could not stop Brett Kavanaugh from becoming nominated to the Supreme Court based upon his credentials, because he's thoroughly qualified, no one argues otherwise, it would be an argument to the point of embarrassment to argue that a person that has written 300 different case studies, so to speak. I mean, this man is well versed, and some of the things he's written has been adopted by the Supreme Court. Some of the language he's used in some of his writings has been adopted by the Supreme Court because this man is a scholar of the first order. So I just knew that if they could not stop him at the point of the hearing, and he sailed through that in flying colors, I knew then that they were going to try something else in order to stop him, because they do not want to have a strong 5-4 verdict on that court, where the court is turned toward constitutionalism. In other words, a 5-4 verdict where the court is now moving toward a conservative court, one in which the Constitution is now looked at as being the law of the land, and the basis of it being based on the rulings, where the court doesn't make the law but interpret the law. I knew there's going to be some problems here with those persons that want to have expansive government and go from underneath what is in fact bequeathed to the federal government under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, where it itemized in 18 different clauses what are the powers of the federal government. I knew that they did not want that to stand. And a 5-4 court that's conservative is a threat to this big government that we have created over the period of time that we've been in existence, where now we got more people in the federal government than we have in the largest business in this country. And look how we started out in the country, and look where we are right now. So I was just waiting for the other shoe to drop. They couldn't stop Kavanaugh at the, how you hit him off at the pass, as they say. They couldn't stop him in the hearing. So now the idea is to stop him at the pass, and so we have this allegation out here right now that he was in fact doing something when he was 17 years old, and we now have this accusation that he was at a party, and at the party, he and a person named Mark Judge were supposed to, according to, what's her name, Christine Ford, supposedly they accosted this 15-year-old girl at a party, and she was physically attacked and molested, not raped, but molested, and kept that quiet for 30-some odd years, never said anything to anybody about it. Nobody at the party recalls it, and Mark Judge denies it ever happened. But we now have this thrown out there, and now we have another visiting of the allegations made by the Democrats. When they can't stop you at the confirmation, they then bring up the sexual allegation. We saw it with Roy Moore in Alabama. We saw it with Herman Cain, who was running for president. It stopped him. We saw it with Clarence Thomas in 1991, and there was an attempt to stop him from sitting on the court with Anita Hill, and now we have it coming up again. And I was just waiting for it. I knew that there was going to be something coming out making an allegation against this man when he could not, in fact, do anything to impugn his integrity as a jurist. So now we have the sexual allegation that is, in fact, playing out. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens here, because the question is whether or not these Democrats, and I'm not talking about Democrats in terms of the term what the term means. I'm talking about those in the Democratic Party. So those who call themselves Democrats, those that call themselves Republicans, those Democrats, those that are really in the Democratic Party running in the Republican Party, those that are running is more feasible in some cases where the Democrats run at those in the Democratic Party, those who believe in the Democratic Party's ideals, they run in the Republican Party, but because it's more, because the state may lean toward the Republican Party. So they run as, the Democrats run as Republicans because it's more, the likelihood of getting elected is, they're more likely to get elected as Republicans than as Democrats, but they agree with the Democrats. And so you have you have Democrats, I'm talking about the parties. You have Democrats in the Republican Party and you have Republicans in the Democratic Party. And before coming on the air, we were talking about whether or not this will be enough, this allegation be enough to sink the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh. And the answer to that question is one that the jury is out. But let's watch some of these they call them rhinos, Republicans in name only, as if that's not all of them. And dinos, the Democrats in name only. And that's all of them too. There are no Democrats in the Democratic Party. People do not believe in democracy. The Democratic Party is now a party of socialists, with Bernie Sanders being on the far left. But they're all on the left.
Bernie's actually more honest. The rest of them want to conceal that. They don't want you to really dawn on you what they are. He's willing to admit that, even though he's a nut job, in my opinion. At least he's kind of an honest nut job. Yeah.
He is a nut job, and so are the rest of them. Rush Limbaugh was saying this morning on his program. He was saying that this is a sickness that you have on the left. And when he said that, I couldn't help but think about the work by Lyle Rossiter, medical doctor who did a book called Liberalism, The Psychological Causes of Political Madness. And that's been documented. This madness, this sickness, the psychological illness of those on the left, that's been documented. And we see it throughout the history of this country as well. We see it throughout history. We see it throughout the history of this country. Liberalism is a mental disorder. And if you look at Maxine Waters, just look at the Senate Judiciary Committee 2 weeks ago. Just go back and look at that committee. Cory Booker. Go back and look at what Cory Booker did. Cory Booker had been told that morning, they had written him and told him that his bringing out that information about about Kavanaugh's past, that was not classified information. He could in fact use that if he wanted to at the hearing. He gets in the hearing and tells the Judiciary Committee chair that he was going to basically fall in the sword. He's going to have his Spartacus moment, he said. And he's going to, in fact, reveal at the expense of being at the possible expense of putting himself in danger of being expelled from the Senate by coming up and sharing with the public, who has the right to know, because we are a democracy, we are a republic, and the people have a right to know. He's going to reveal some information about Kavanaugh that is in fact not supposed to be revealed. All of this was out. This was not classified information, and Cory Booker knew it. And so just go back and listen to what they did. And then go back and look at what happened as the chair was opening up the committee. The committee meeting was being opened up. He's making his opening statement. And the woman that's the Senator Harris, from California, who has ambitions to become to be a nominee for the Democratic Party in 2020, she interrupts the chairperson in his opening statement. He doesn't even get his opening statement out because they had gotten together, the Democrats had gotten together, those in the Democratic Party had gotten together, and they had already planned they're going to disrupt the meeting and not even allow the hearing to be held. And so she was, Mr. Chairman, and he kept trying to go with his opening statement. Mr. Chairman, I want to make a motion, and she wanted to have the motion was to have the hearing suspended because they had had an information dump, 42,000 pages, were placed before them the day before the hearing, as if they're going to read those 42,000 pages no matter how much more time they have. This is the party that told us that you have to pass the law in order to know what's in it. All of a sudden they want to read everything. And so the chairman wasn't able to get through a statement, and then it was seconded by another person. Mr. Chairman, I agree with my colleague that we should in fact suspend the hearing. And then a third Democrat said, Mr. Chairman, I would make a motion that we adjourn the hearing, that we adjourn, that the meeting be adjourned. There were all these theatrics going on here. We had never seen that happen before in the history of the Senate. Now, we've seen some theatrics in the past in the Senate, but we've never seen that kind of tactic being used because they wanted to try to delay it so that we'll have the election first, and then we would have the hearing through which they would have gone through the election, and therefore the people would have spoken, and those Democrats that are exposed if they vote against the nominee because they're in these red states, they would have gone past the election, therefore not be in jeopardy, and they can vote against the nominee. So that's why they wanted to postpone this hearing. But now, when that didn't work, and they got through it anyway, and they're on track to have the vote Thursday of this week is when they're supposed to have the vote on the hearing, and right now it looks like that's kind of in doubt right now unless they call the accuser before the committee between now and Thursday. It might be able to call it and have the same day, have the hearing Thursday, and then after the hearing listen to the rebuttal to the accusation, and then have the committee to vote and make the recommendation to the Senate, with the Senate voting probably the last part of the month, probably the first part of October, for the up or down vote on the confirmation of the nominee. And we don't know yet how that's going to play out because we have Democrats that are inside. I'm talking about Democratic Party members. We have Democratic Party members that are hiding out in the Republican Party, like Flake, for example, Murkowski from Alaska, Susan Collins over there in Maine, and some of these others. I'm not so sure that the senator from South Carolina, I'm not so sure that he's not laying in snake in the grass. But I think a lot of them would like to have that court weighted toward the more liberal, kind of like Hamiltonians in a way. Because Hamilton was the one that talked about and brought up the idea of implied powers. Hamilton creates that idea that the Constitution does not just say what it says, it also says what it doesn't say. That there are some things that it doesn't say so much explicitly in the Constitution, but it's implied by the language that is found there.
He also he wanted the centralized bank too, didn't he?
He wanted a centralized bank,
and the others feared that too. And let's face it, they saw I don't know why he ignored the lessons they learned from watching European powers being controlled by those who control the money supply to them. I don't know why he didn't learn that lesson that the other people seem to learn, but it's puzzling.
Yeah, Hamilton was quite a piece of work. You know, one thing about when you're outside of power, and power is being arrayed and used against you, and you have a way of course, you don't like it when you are the victim of how it's being used. And Hamilton objected to it as those others that were in the Continental Army. Of course, they would object to the oppression, because the oppression will affect them. But that's when you are out of power. When you get in power, you're in power now, and when you're in power, you do some of the same things that you were objecting to, because you do, you know how they say, do unto others as you have them do unto you. Well, you do unto others what they cannot do to you, because you're now wielding power, and now you're in the command post. And that's one of the catch-22s of power. That this idea that power, Lord Acton said power tends to corrupt. And he said absolute power corrupts absolutely. But that's not really it. People that are objecting to how power is being used are objecting to how power is being used against them. They're not objecting to the use of power. In other words, they're not arguing out of some virtuous place here. They are objecting to the fact that the power that's being wielded affects them. And you see a lot of these people go from powerlessness to power. And when they get in there, they can't remember the objection. We saw that in the French Revolution and so on, where once they gained power, these Republicans that were objecting to the wielding of power, that beheaded Louis the 15th and Marie Antoinette, that totalitarianism they complained about, they had a revolution. But when they got in power, even Robespierre, who was one of the person that was spearheading the revolution, they even cut his head off. Robespierre was beheaded. And when they asked the Frenchmen after this revolution had run its course, they said, "What did you do during the revolution?" And there was some that was saying, "I lived," because they were killing everybody. It was a bloodlust that went on there. And that's when you start wielding power, because people that's in power are normally those that are pursuing power do not pursue power out of virtue. You have to restrain them. And the founders understood that. And Hamilton got in there, you know, after having fought against the British, wanted to get in. He got in there and wanted to duplicate what the British had done. He wanted a strong federal government. And those such as James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, who were part of the revolutionary process. Now, Jefferson was not at the Constitutional Convention, but Jefferson was the one who wrote the Declaration of Independence. So these revolutionaries knew what that fight was about, and they saw that this was being compromised by Alexander Hamilton. And they stood up against Hamilton and tried to bring it back under the control that had been mandated by the Constitution. And that fight is going on from 1792, and I would say from 1792 to 1825. I would say that some would say it ends in 1815. The Federalist Party, they said that it would be from 1792 to 1815, and that when James Madison comes in, not Madison, but James Monroe came in, they're saying that when Monroe came in with the era of good feelings, they're saying that he would have therefore brought an end to it, and now the party is out of power, never to gain power again. And then the Democrat and Republican Party, there's a split that goes on, and the Democratic Party stands back up as a different party because they lost some of their bearing. They became the Democratic Party under Andrew Jackson, who became the first Democratic Party president. But you have to keep in mind that the history of the country is Democrat-Republican, and that meant that they were one and the same. And this idea that there are two different groups. It can be that politically, and you can name the parties that, But if you are a Democrat, you have to be a Republican. If you're a Republican, you have to be a Democrat, because they're part and parcel of the same piece of the puzzle, and they're the flip sides of each other. If you have a person that's a Democrat and not a Republican, then we're talking about political parties here. And I would claim that there are neither in either of the two parties. They're not Democrats in the Democratic Party. I've said this before on a number of occasions, and they're not Republicans in the Republican Party, because it's just names that they've taken as a way of selling themselves to the American people, as if the Democrats are somehow different from the Republicans, as both of them are wielding power outside of the auspices of the Constitution of the United States, neither being restrained by it. So we're going to watch everything that goes on, because we know that unless the people are vigilant, then we the people cannot have a government of the people unless the people maintain their due diligence and maintain the restraints that we in fact put in place at the Constitutional Convention. And we bequeath these powers to the federal government, and it's our responsibility in every generation thereafter to hold the government responsible for the limitation of that power. Okay, we got to get out of here. Thanks for staying with us the last hour. I want you to always follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.